Surely one of the high points in the Torah is the moment when Moses is at the burning bush, God appears to him, speaks to him, a holy moment, and Moses says, just one thing, what should I tell people your name is? I know you're a God, I know you're something important here, what's your name? This would be in Exodus chapter 3, verse 14. Looking at the Hebrew here. And God said to Moses, famously, Ehyeh asher ehyeh. And he said, thus you will tell the sons of Israel, Ehyeh sent me to you. This phrase is most commonly thought to be built on the Hebrew verb hayah, which means something like to be, maybe not in the deep philosophical sense of the Greek tradition, but nevertheless often translated this way, to be. The verbal sense here of the phrase ehyeh, this so-called prefix conjugation or the imperfect, could mean something like I will be, or it could even mean something like I might be or I could be, or something in that zone. It's really not exactly clear. Scholars debate about how to take tense in Hebrew, and in particularly the tense or aspect or mood, or however you want to put it, of this particular phrase. Ehyeh asher ehyeh. I will be whatever I will be, or I am what I am, most famously, probably as people know it. So the first name that God actually gives here, when he's going to give his personal name, is not the word that will come to be associated with God's personal name. We'll get to that in a second, but rather this phrase, Ehyeh asher ehyeh, a phrase, a sentence. And then later says, tell them, Ehyeh sent me. But then, verse 15, but then God spoke again to Moses, saying, thus you will tell the sons of Israelites, Adonai Elohei Avotechem, the Lord, the God of your fathers. That's my name, the Lord. Now, the Lord, what do you mean, the Lord? Hebrew has a word for Lord, Adonai, for example, or Adoni, my Lord, or Adon, Lord. And so there's a word for that, but that's not this word. In English translations of the Bible, when you see the translation, the word Lord in English, but it's in all capital letters, sometimes with a big L and then kind of like smaller but still uppercase, O-R-D, that is the signal that they are translating this personal name of God. I'll draw it on my little marker board here, which is not exactly a high-tech thing to be doing on the video here, but it's kind of what I got, and so this is what I'm going to give you. And it looks like this. In Hebrew, these are the letters Y, Yod, He, H, Vav, or a W, kind of pronounced like a V, and then an H again. Yod, He, Vav, He, the so-called tetragrammaton, the four-letter name. How is it pronounced? I pronounced it when I read it in Hebrew as Adonai. Indeed, that is the Hebrew reading tradition. When you're reading Hebrew in a group of people and you get to the name, Hashem, sometimes in Hebrew, people will say, when you get to this, you say Adonai, which isn't really strictly pronounced like that. Adonai means my lords in the plural. So now we have this plural thing again, kind of like with Elohim. So they use this word Adonai, which means my lords in the plural. Again, maybe a plural of majesty or greatness or everything all in one, this one thing, kind of an idea there. So how is this word pronounced, and why are people saying Adonai instead of this word? Well, many Jews today would pronounce it, and certainly Christians would pronounce it as Yahweh. And you may have heard this word Yahweh before as one idea for how this name of God might have been pronounced. Where did anybody get this idea of Yahweh? Well, we have some early Greek translations of the Bible, sometimes transliterated or wrote out this word in their own letters in Greek as something like, terrible handwriting here, but something like this, Yahweh. So you kind of get some sense that maybe even in an early period they had a pronunciation like that, Yahweh, something in that zone. But at some point, we don't know exactly at what point or why, but at some point in the early or Israelite, or I could even say early Jewish tradition, there was an aversion to pronouncing the name out loud. It was considered so sacred and so holy it couldn't even be said. In fact, in the Bible, in the book of Psalms, there's a whole kind of miniature collection of Psalms in the Bible, sometimes called the Elohistic Psalter, which repeats Psalms that had been in there earlier, but instead of the word Adonai, Hashem, Yahweh, they put the word Elohim instead. showing that there was some sense of like replacement, that you would replace this word with something else. In fact, in the pointed text of the Hebrew Bible, they do something with this word, with these letters. And they do it in order to make sure that the reader knows not to pronounce the name by its letters. In fact, in strict traditional Jewish tradition, to pronounce the name by its letters is a very bad offense indeed. Christians have typically not taken it this way, and I had many Jewish teachers in my own secular graduate schooling who would, say the word Yahweh. It's not like they didn't, I think they didn't want to be superstitious about it or whatever, but certainly in traditional worship settings, you wouldn't just pronounce the name, right? But they did something to mark the fact that you shouldn't pronounce it that was really fascinating, which actually has a consequence for us today in our language for God. Really fascinating. They took this word and they put the vowel letters, these are just consonants in Hebrew, not vowels. The original spoken language, of course, had vowels, but in the earliest written documents we have, like the Dead Sea Scrolls, they don't have vowel points in there, just the consonants. So later tradition, a medieval Jewish tradition, put vowel points in to vocalize and in a sense interpret the reading for people. And they basically took a different word entirely. I'm going to write that word here. That would be the word Adonai. There's the word Adonai, reading this way. And they took, I'm going to put the vowel points under it and around it. See these little dots I put around it? This thing that looks like a T is an ah sound. That's an O up there, and that's an ah sound too, going this way. Adonai, my lords. They took these vowels and they actually put them around a different word, this word, Yahweh, or the letters YHWH, so that it looked a little something like this. And I'll circle the vowels. So do you see, I know it's confusing if you don't read Hebrew, but this little 2-dot thing, forget about that straight line. So they put the 2 dots up there, and they take this little thing here that's like an A sound, and they put it there. They usually leave the O out, but they just put these in here as a cue that when you see this word, you're supposed to read it like this word. Do you get it? It's like a code, like, oh, when you see it, don't say this, say Adonai. So that's the reading tradition. Now, this had an interesting result in the history of interpretation in language. A kind of mistake that became part of common usage. And the mistake was like this. There was an individual, a church official, a confessor to one of the popes, in the 16th century, I believe around the year 1518, had made a famous mistranslation that made its way into the Latin tradition and then into the English tradition. And that mistake was, he basically took this word, the holy personal name of God, Yahweh, YHWH, with these vowels and just wrote it out like a Latin transcription. And in Latin, J and Y during this period were not actually distinguished. So if you write this out, and if you write the Y as a J, you get J, E, H, O, if you put the O up there, okay. O, V, right? Does that sound like a word that you've maybe heard before? I'll write it out here. It's the word Jehovah, right? Jehovah, not a name of God, not a name of God in Hebrew, not a name of God in any period, not a biblical word for God at all, but it's kind of like a mistaken translation of the divine name with the vowels from the wrong word, from the word that you're to use as the substitute word, right? This is where we get this beautiful word Jehovah. I love the word Jehovah. It has a beautiful ring to it, and so on, but a word born out of a mistake like that. I realize that there's a group of Christians whose belonging maybe in Christian circles is questioned by some because of their Christology and other factors. The Jehovah's Witnesses who have this word, in their name. It's a beautiful word. There are beautiful hymns and Christian songs that have the word Jehovah in it. I'm not against the word Jehovah. This is not an anti-Jehovah screed here. I just want to point out historically where that word came from. This word though, Adonai, or the Lord, or Yahweh, appears. It's the most frequent word for God, not God, God, but this personal name, the Lord. It appears, I think, around 6,000 times in the Hebrew Bible. So it is the mainstream word, the name of God. The word Elohim appears, I think, around 2,600 times, and that even includes instances where maybe it's used to mean gods, like other gods in the plural, just by itself as Elohim. But this word, Adonai, Hashem, Yahweh, the Lord, this is the personal name of God that's given which gave birth to this word Jehovah. You might ask too, like, well, is there any evidence outside the Bible of this word or its pronunciation or anything like that? Interestingly, the earliest clear evidence that we seem to have of it comes from Egyptian texts. Egyptian texts from the 14th and 13th and 12th century BC, the 1300s, where some Egyptian authors actually speak of the land north of them, a little bit to the northeast of them, in Canaan or Palestine or Israel, where people were living, various kinds of nomadic groups or Bedouin type groups. They call them shasu. And they actually call the land something like, they call the land Yau or Yahoo, which is a potential pronunciation as well, or you could say Yahweh or Yahoo of the shasu Bedouin. So there seems to have been some recognition that this word, this name, was a geographic title for some land in the kind of southern desert regions that at least Egyptians wrote about at that time. Whether or not it's the exact word for the god or there's some other connection, it's not totally clear, but it seems close enough that I think we can draw that kind of line there. So that's a really interesting linguistic or historical fact, and we don't know very much else about it. We do have this moment though in in Exodus chapter 3. What's your name? I am what I am. I'll be whatever I will be. I mean, maybe you could interpret that as like him saying, you'll see what I am, or I'm not going to tell you what I am, or something like that. But then he does. Then he says, my name is Yahweh. Then he says, okay, but tell them actually, my name is the Lord, Adonai. Hashem, the name, or pronounced by its letters in the popular way, Yahweh.